Welcome everyone to this. I hope, inshallah, it will be exciting evening with two of our authors. Um, is first of its kind that ILS organized. Alhamdulillah, I hope, inshallah, that is the first of many. Um, though some of you may be aware of what ILS does and its activity, for those who are not, and perhaps a little introduction to the society will help. ILS started in 2019 with the aim and objective of kind of promoting primarily Islamic literature, kind of connecting the bridge between the old and the modern. So promoting classical as well as modern literature. And there are a number of ways that we do this. One of the ways to a reading club. So we have a kind of regular reading club. We have book launches, book reviews, events such as this one, albeit it's the first one, inshallah. But we hope to do others, and also interviewing with the author. So when you visit the website, inshallah, you'll find that we have a number of interviews with a different authors from all over the world, primarily in an academic setting, but it is accessible to everyone. The project started as a personal interest, and alhamdulillah is expanding, and inviting Muslims from all walks of life to contribute, as well as to and to encourage our children. And this is the most important part, to encourage our children, inshallah. We have two authors here, and I'm grateful to them, on behalf of ILS as well as personally. Brother Jamil was kind enough. I have to say this. I emailed him 3 o'clock at night when I first came across his book. The next day, about 10 o'clock, he delivered the book to my house. I mean, that's better than Amazon, right? $7.99 at Prime Amazon doesn't do that fast. So barakallah fi for your help. Since then he's been a very interesting character, a friend of mine. I would consider him a friend of mine, albeit we met face to face no more than like 5-6 minutes. But he agreed with everything that I proposed on behalf of ILS. So jazakumullah khairan for that, and I really, really appreciate it. And I read your book. I wrote review of your book. So it's something that I enjoyed it. And when I first heard of your book from Dr. Abdul Hakim Murad from Cambridge College, I must get it. The name of the book is attractive. The color of the actual design is attractive. So it's a fantastic book. And we did have a conversation with your brother Jamil about some of the content. So yeah, jazakumullah for that. I really, really appreciate it, and for you to join us. So welcome to ILS.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me.
And the next one is my old friend, and I say old, I know him for what? Now is 18 years. Hisham, we go a long way. I know his work, I know his thought. Hopefully we used to sit in the coffee shop hours and hours and hours. I know of his work, I know he's passionate about it. So we got him to publish the book that we're gonna discuss, inshallah. ILS published, and he was kind enough to donate the book to us, and we published it. So I welcome you, brother Hisham, and thank you for your time and your agreeing to do this.
It's a pleasure, man.
So yeah, and I also welcome everyone else for taking time out to join us. The way this program is going to run, inshallah, I mean, first 10-15 minutes with the introduction, which we just done. Then I'm going to ask each author to either read something about their work, for 20 minutes, read about their work and read something from their work and talk about it and how they're going to. It's about them. The show is about you, the authors. And then we can have direct question. Direct question either to the author. If you want to ask direct, put your hand up. If not, you can write it and I will ask them. But this program is really about sharing the experience. You see, poetry, Hisham once told me poetry is life itself. And I think this is a very important thing, that everyone has something to say and everyone got experience. And tonight is about the poet and Hisham. So it's about you brothers. So inshallah, 20 minutes to you guys, and you can talk about it. We would like to hear you read some of your poem, and then we can ask question and get some kind of personal insight to your experience. So I'll leave it to you guys. Who wants to go first?
I don't mind.
You're all right with the Jamel?
Do you want me to go first, or
Yeah, you go. Well,
Yeah, I'm happy with
yeah.
that.
Before that, I mean, I will inshallah give you guys a link to, since Hisham is going first, link to the book that you can buy from Amazon. It will really help ILS, and so you can read it. But unfortunately, this event meant to be live, but knowing how things are at the moment, we decided to go with Zoom. So I will definitely put link to inshallah. Go, brothers. The platform is yours.
okay? Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and hello to others. I just talking about poetry is on one hand really easy, and on another hand it's very difficult, because like the host said, I once said to him that poetry is like life, and that sounds quite superficial on one level, but on another level it sounds like it's almost unfathomable, and it's both those things, but I think the place to actually start is with what is, I mean, what does poetry mean? I mean, the word itself comes from a Greek word which means to construct, to build, and the question is, what is the poet building? That's, I mean, most people tend to associate poetry with something that happens subconsciously. I mean, you know, everybody knows about the poet and his muse, or where there's a kind of switching off when that moment of inspiration comes to him. So it's like a kind of, it's an experience of dislocation. It's like a transportation into another world, but it's not. I mean, I think there are poets who write like that, and there are poets who, when you ask them about poetry, I mean, and there are like famous examples from, you know, from Keats, you know, back and forth, and they'll tell you that poetry is actually something that you can't explain, and you just have to kind of, you know, read it and be transported by it, you know, and you kind of have to feel it, but basically, but it's actually a lot more immediate than that. It's a lot, there's a lot of conscious activity in writing poetry. Well, at least for me, I mean, and at least certainly for the Greeks, who, you know, they didn't invent it, but, you know, they needed it more than others, which is another discussion. But okay, so we need to get back to this idea of building. So when a poet writes a poem, what he's doing for you is he's building a kind of a structure, like a house, if you like, which is where you can step into and you can experience the world in the same way that you experience it as you're going about your daily activities. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's more heightened, but it's like I build this house for you, or a poet builds this space for you, where you can consciously step inside and experience life, and hopefully in some way he'll guide you towards some kind of understanding of it. And I think that's the key for poetry. Is that it's not about sort of, you know, just letting your fancy roam. It's about your emotions, or my emotions, reaching out to your emotions and trying to build some kind of replica of, you know, of life in how it feels and how it makes sense. I think that's the key motivation, I think, for certainly for me as a poet. I mean, it in the same way that, I mean, the reason why people are so fond of music is for a similar reason. It is because it fuses together, you know, sort of an idea of how life feels, but also at the same time what it means. I mean, music is like an exaggerated extension of that. I mean, the reason why is I don't know, is deceptive and ultimately misleading is because I would say that the feeling dominates over the meaning. That, I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons why it's prohibited in Islam, is because you know, one just overwhelms the other. But with poetry, with language, you don't really have, you can have a danger with the meaning side of things, but with the feeling, it's, you know, not really the case because there's no musical instruments involved. Well, not in my poetry anyway. So yeah, that's what I kind of, I mean, and prayer. I'm just branching off here from, you know, the kind of the kind of the stem of poetry itself, but even prayer. I mean, prayer is like the rawest form of what I'm trying to talk about. What when you pray, or when you use the words that are given to you to pray with, whether you're a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Christian or whatever, it's doing the same thing. It's giving you a kind of an emotional pathway, and at the same time, it's explaining where you're going. And in the Quran, that kind of, you know, that's, it can't go beyond that. You know, that's why it is what it is. It's like the highest form of what I'm talking about. You know, it's somewhere where you can literally live emotionally quite safe, well, really safe. So poetry does something, we do it on a much lower level. So as Muslims, we should count ourselves quite fortunate, really, that that we have I don't want to say a poem, but a book that makes sense of your emotional life, your kind of tactile, just your existence, but at the same time deeply respecting and guiding your emotional activities safely, because obviously it's the one who made you has kind of set it out for you, so it couldn't be any other way. But from my point of view, and from other sort of I would say my poetry is not really for Muslims, as odd as that kind of sounds, because they already have a recourse to what I'm doing. If it can do anything for them, it makes them more appreciative of of that text, and and what it actually means to have it. Because what you need to remember is that all cultures live within a poetic text. I mean, you can't think of like Greece without Homer. You can't even you can't think of the Hindus without Bhagavad Gita. There's just countless, infinite examples. Every single culture has like a poetic house in which they live, and there's a reason why. That's what I've just tried to explain. I just hope it made some kind of sense. Is that my 20 minutes up?
Yeah, I just want to add.
Gone on too long?
No, yes. I'm going to give the mic to Brother Jamil, but I want to add one thing to what Hisham said. The reason is because I know him from so long, and I've discussed this issue for, like I said, hours and hours in a local coffee shop. I personally enjoyed Hisham's poetry for one reason. It's a kind of summary of human existence. So it has a three-layer. It kind of has a triangular approach to it. So you have the beginning, the pre-Adam stage of human being. So the conversation between the shaitan and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, kind of, and that applies to a majority of the religious community, be a Muslim or non-Muslim. And then you have the world, and then kind of returning back to the hereafter. And the world, and he makes it very interestingly, the world is a place where you experience things, and that experience in itself translate as poetry and transcend beyond a cultural identity. And it is that part of Hisham poem that I found it interesting, that it can be read by anyone, albeit it has a religious Islamic theme to it. It can be read by anyone, and it can be enjoyed by anyone, and everyone can relate to it. For example, if an atheist reads it, he may not relate to the pre-Adam section of it or the ending of it, but he relates to the life of it. So there is something for it, for everyone in that poem. And I think this is the part that I personally enjoy. Now, going back to Brother Jamil, I read his poem and I spent reading it more than discussing it. With Hisham, I discussed it. And like I did to Hisham, I will definitely commentate on it, but I really enjoyed it. There was a particular part that I asked Brother Jamil, what does it mean? And he did tell me. But I will leave that to the last moment, and I will give it the floor to you, brother.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's going to be difficult to follow Hisham and that kind of analysis of poetry, but what what I think I'll do is speak a little bit about the work that that Abdul Hay spoke so kindly about. It's a collection of short stories and poetry, and the title of it is "The Leaf of the Neem Tree," and that's for any South Asians or East Africans or even Caribbean people. I learned recently will know that the neem tree is historically used as a kind of medicine across different cultures. And where I got it from was there's a line in the biopic made about the Pakistani and Indian writer Saadat Hasan Manto, in which he says that the leaves of the neem tree may be bitter, but they do clean the blood. And that's kind of broadly speaking what the book is about. There's a few themes that run through it around grief, around language, around history, but I would say that the thing that ties them together is the kind of bitterness that is associated with those things, and death being the kind of universally the bitter truth that everyone will have to taste, and so that's where the kind of book sits thematically. As I said, there's poems and there's short stories that all sit within that. If I may, I'm just going to share a few poems, if that's okay. Unless you wanted to save that for another.
No, no, we want to hear you some of your part. Don't give all of it though, other people are gonna buy it. Is it? You want to give some of your part of your poem, so go ahead, please.
Thank you. So, as I said, one of the themes of the book was kind of language, and mainly I've been exploring when writing the book poetry in Urdu, and while I haven't attempted to translate Urdu poetry in this book, but more what I've done in a few of the poems, a couple of which I'm going to share, is kind of write in response to them in kind of contemporary poetic style. So I don't pretend to, or mostly contemporary. There's a couple of ghazals that I have tried to write in English, but essentially I've tried to bring that, I guess, the spirit of Urdu poetry into a contemporary poetic form of mostly free verse. And yeah, without further ado and waffling about it too much, I'll recite the first one. This is a poem called Tongue. Make dua for me, cry for me, pour the Nile from your eyes. Beseech him for me, friend. How do you make a prayer? Translation is among our strangest pastimes, both most and least fruitful. Do you whisper or say it in your heart? Dua karna is to do dua, to do prayer, to make it, to drop softness into coarse palms. Eyes need cooling because the world burns. Take a short breath and place me in the middle. Sometimes I don't feel worthy. Can you lend me your longing? What's life but a long ghazal anyway, a lover's meeting disallowed. They call some deaths a wedding, how brave and lovely. Union is not for this life, so make a prayer on my behalf. Dua karna, beloved, in any tongue, whichever comes most easily when you dream. That's tongue. Another thing that I've done is respond to specific poems from I guess, the older, well, not really older, but the Urdu tradition. And one of the poems that and not only Urdu, but Arabic, a little bit of Arabic as well. And this is a poem that I wrote in response to a Mahmoud Darwish poem titled On This Earth, Ala Hadhihi al-Ard. A child eating fruit her ancestors had only heard of in stories. A father teaching his child the wudu for the first time. A lover finding her beloved unwanting of anything else. Dawn breaking on a prisoner who drinks the sun. Fairs' couplets. Malcolm's smile, the eternity of Arabic, salawat from Dakar to Delhi, the strength of coriander seeds crushed with stone, eating with your hands in the safety of company, a song shared by 2 generations, an old man's change of heart, a row of believers praying on the picket line, the silence of enemies in the face of interlocked fingers, a long-awaited victory and the memory of winter, a child waking up in Kashmir to find her father has returned. I'm going to do one more. As I said, one of the themes of this book was death that kind of unintentionally kept coming up again and again. A lot of this book was written over COVID, and there was obviously a lot of death around us at the time. And so this poem is called Graveland. I know of no cemetery this side of the cosmos whose eyes shine at the thought of having me. Maybe once a decade they mention me in the valley, but it's been a long time since anyone I've touched rested there longer than a wink. Take me to the court of the Sultan. I'll audition to be the national poet of Qabristan, write our anthem on the ground in 2.5 languages, in free verse, and adorn the earth. In most graveyards I've been to, we've been assigned the Muslim quarter, where I've been careful not to step on barely marked graves and read Arabic inscriptions on the stones of others built to last. I've met with flowers kept fresh by children and wondered about the care in making sure even this place looks beautiful. Like turbaned gravestones outside a mosque in Mostar that give you pause when you notice almost all of them have the same year of death. I think I'll stop there for now. But that's a kind of, I guess, a selection of a few of the poems in the book. And I guess to respond to something that Hisham said, I think for me, when thinking about building a poem, one of the kind of, I guess you can call it North Stars is trying to ensure I make something beautiful, right? If you're welcoming somebody into a house, you want to clean it up and make it look as presentable as possible. And I think for me, that's a big part of that construction of the poem or the story. That if it doesn't have that, then it's going to be less impactful or less useful in any way. So that was just something that came to mind when you were speaking about poetry. But Abdul, I'll hand over back to you. I hope people enjoyed those few pieces as well.
Jazakumullah for that. Certainly I did. I like I said, I read it cover to cover, and I kind of finished it very soon because I have particularly interest in poetry, albeit I'm not eloquent as you two, but there is some interest in it. I think what I got from your book certainly gives this message, albeit like you said, may not be directly, kind of death and afterlife and kind of moving from here to somewhere else. One thing I found
change
interesting.
position because my connection is bad.
Sure.
Sorry.
No worries. Jamal, one thing I found very interesting about your poetry, that you speak from the heart. It's more personal, and poetry that which is personal is more interesting than writing as a subject. The subject is kind of distant in your way. You're kind of imagining it. You're not saying what you really want to say just so that it fits into the pattern of to your reader. But when you wrote poetry and I read it, it's not coming from. That's what I felt. It's not coming from a format. But I just have to feel it's coming from yourself. It's hard. Or like you, hate it, and that's what makes poetry fascinating. And that kind of links with poetry being life, because it is your life. Your life, you are a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, you're the perfect and poetry in itself is a, you know, it's a very self-recognizing if you use the right way. You know, you can lead to, you know, that it also has the other side to it that makes you arrogant and, you know, very proud of your verses. We have the famous line from Mutanabbi where he talks about himself. You know, he refers to himself as the lion and refers to himself as the pen and the qalam and kashta things called or other type of self, self praise, which makes it, and and he even said in one of his verse, my verses will make the blind see and a deaf man hear. So albeit it's a wrong sense he used it, nevertheless it's about him, and that's what you portray your poetry, your book. It's about you. It's real, and it's you know it's down to earth kind of thing, and that's what makes it interesting. Book is good only when it's related to the others. A writing is only good when other people can relate to it, you know. And your book certainly does that. And I really enjoy it, especially the part how is Pakistan, was it? And what was that again? How was Pakistan?
It's still there.
I was still there. I mean, it's two verse. Some people might say, well, what's the poetic about it? But the poetic about it is that it is where it is. You moved on. The country don't move on. You define that. That's the meaning I gave, and I found it profound. So yeah, it's a book worth certainly having it. I mean, I couldn't wait to get hold of that book. So I encourage everyone to buy both Jamil poetry, and I know he wrote another one, and I know he's also involved in um, doing some filming, right, Jamil? So
Yeah, some
so
film work.
I advise everyone to follow him and keep in touch and to with his work. And I personally find it very fascinating, interesting. Um, with all that said, it's 7:04. I mean, we scheduled for 1.5 hours, so I'll leave everyone to ask the authors directly. Or you can ask me, and then I can ask the authors about any question that you may have. It doesn't have to be formal. It just speak out. If someone wants to recite a poem themselves, they're more than welcome to do it. But it is a nice evening of poetry, so let's make it that, inshallah. So any question? I mean, I have a few questions, which I will leave it to the last moment.
Did you want me to read something from my poem? Because I
Yes,
just forgot.
Go, inshallah.
In case people are kind of expecting me to, I'm
Yeah.
doing it because I think it should be done.
No, because I didn't.
You might have been expecting it. Yeah.
No, yeah, go on. That was the thing. Yes, go on, please.
All right. I'll read you. Okay. As you may well or may well not have gathered, the poem is basically a history of the world in verse. I mean, it starts from the beginning, and I try and cover as much of history as I can, and in terms of focusing on key epochs, which have an enormous effect on what comes afterwards. So they're the ones that I've tried to flesh out. So I'll start from World War One. Just I'll read from there and then try and bring it up as much as I can to now, or as near to now as I can. So on the 28th of June, 1914, a shot rings out in Belgrade that makes the whole of Europe scream. A world war, they say, not concealing what they mean. Nations all belligerent and pursuing the same scheme. Our wealth is not enough. Let us take some more. Conscript the young and savages and let us go to war. Scars upon the earth that a century won't heal. The youth of 20 nations slaughtered in the kill. A great war, they say, not concealing what they mean. Really just a family feud between some kings and queens. A sort of Pied Piper staring in defeat at visions of apocalypse, but his small moustache kept neat. The leader of 10 million men, alone now in a room, his mausoleum left unfinished and a bunker for a tomb. It was not long ago that I stood up in a hall and made myself look big by making everyone look small. I told him in no uncertain words that I would clean the streets from those filthy foreigners that everywhere you meet. I gave them all a vision of another time when Germany was not just great, but close to being sublime. The economic misery and cultural disgrace will never in 1,000 years come back to show its face. These nations which surround us are mongrelized and weak. With me as your Führer, they will not dare to speak. Look at my divisions, warriors of steel, accompanied by Valkyries whose presence I can feel. An advance across 4 continents coming to an end, but delusions and insanity making some pretend. I said the ice would thaw, thinking I was God, but 2 million Germans froze where they all once trod. One by one, the Allies are taking back from me the things that I have taken oh so easily. I've been betrayed by people under me. I was wrong to expect such great things from Germany. Let it all go up in flames, they deserve to burn. Perhaps from their failures, others might still learn. I once had a mother who loved me very much. What would I give again to feel her tender touch? Auschwitz, Balzac, Belsen, and Dachau are his shame. The worst that human beings do was standing for his name. That's enough. I could go on, but it's exhausting.
It's,
That
yeah,
so
which
that's one part of our.
Yeah, Jazakumullah for that. I mean, I read both of them, and alhamdulillah, I'll put a review for the Hisham one as well. I've meant to I did manage to write something on his poetry. Anyone got any question that you'll be good? It's a good time to ask, because I think session like this is, one-to-one with the author. It makes it more interesting than just to read it. So everyone take advantage of it and go ahead with it. Any question? I mean, I certainly have a few. I will ask them, inshallah, but go ahead. Oh, I think everyone's gonna buy the book, so they're gonna just make their mind up. But I have a question for you, Jamil. I mean, I'm gonna try to be a bit harsh here. When you say free verse, and what I understand is that it doesn't follow any particular rhythm or particular, I mean, anything goes. What does that mean? Can you then turn around and say the conversation that I'm having with you is a poem? Can you turn around and say, gibberish that comes out of people? Do you see what I'm trying to say? Now, if your book is based on free verse, then do you have a meaning, or can the meaning be given by each reader? Can each reader have his own meaning? I think, because then you will help the reader, because you can read something and you're wondering, is this what Jamil means, or is it just something that I'm giving it? So I think if you explain that a bit, then whoever is reading it, inshallah, then they can say, well.
I think that there's 2 parts to that question there. One about meaning, and one about the kind of the free verse element. I'll speak to the meaning side of things first. I think there is a case of, as a writer, once you've finished your work, you kind of hand it over, right? You have no control post that point in how people might interpret your work, and I don't think the form is linked to that really, in any way. I think to your point, you can write gibberish and you can write it in the perfect sonnet form, and that doesn't make it any better than something written in, I think, without that particular form. I think for me, the reason why I chose to write mostly in free verse, as I said, there are a few ghazals in the book, is because it's what I'm used to. The modern language, I guess, is, I guess what I'm trying to say is that contemporary poetry is mostly in free verse. I mean, there is a lot of contemporary poetry now that is playing with form and, you know, making new forms and all this kind of interesting stuff. But what I wanted to do, especially because I was heavily inspired by Urdu, mostly Urdu, but some Arabic poetry as well, is that what I wanted to avoid was, which I feel sometimes can happen, is trying to mimic that style and perhaps writing in that form, and the poem then just reading like a translation of a poem that was written 120 years ago. I wanted to make sure that the language was current, but it kept the spirit of those poems. And you know, it's up to the reader how successful I was in that. But I don't think meaning is linked to form particularly. I think form is can be useful. It can be done well. It can be done poorly. I think one of the things that free verse has done is kind of open up the art form to a lot of people. If you give a child who was born, you know, 10 years ago, a sonnet written 200 years ago, they might find the language archaic. They're not used to kind of that meter as such. And it kind of puts poetry over there. And this is speaking specifically to the Western context. I think in South Asia specifically, it's very, very different. I think form is still extremely strong in that part of the world in terms of culturally speaking. People know it's not uncommon for maybe not so much kids today, but people of my parents' generation and before that, it's not uncommon for them to be able to quote Iqbal in the same way that it's not uncommon, I'm sure, for many Palestinians to be able to quote Darwish from memory. And that's and that, I don't think that's the case in the British context. If you speak to the average person on the street, they won't be able to quote I don't know, Auden or whoever it might be from that kind of era. And yeah, contemporary poetry and free verse is kind of what I have grown up in, I guess, when it comes to my most of my reading of poetry, where I came to poetry from. And then later on, when I kind of engaged with the Urdu tradition a bit more and a bit of Arabic and translation mostly, I came to appreciate form a bit more in that sense. So I hope I've answered the question in some small way.
Well, Alhamdulillah, we have two questions for both of you. Firstly, give you a break, Jamil. I asked Hisham, then I come back to you. Is there brother Imran is asking, is there a structure? Your book, does it follow a structure? You know, do you have your own structure, or do you get it from a older book? I mean, do you copy the structure of your book from a previous written work, or is something that you came up with? That's that.
I don't really have any idea about poetry in respect to, you know, meters and certain traditions. I write my poetry a bit like writing a nursery rhyme, to be honest. It's something that's completely self-taught, and the reason that I do it that way is because I want to keep it as simple as I possibly can. The way a nursery rhyme is very simple, and I just, and I find the whole poetic experience, which I, like I said earlier on, is kind of, it's almost indistinguishable from my experience of living. So I don't find life particularly complicated. In many ways, it approaches me in most cases as simple as a nursery rhyme. And I think as a culture, I mean, even globally, people have moved away from that kind of simplicity, and they've been mistaken or seduced by a complexity which is unnecessary. And it's not just in poetry, it's it infects everything in all our kind of interactions with the world. We've just overcomplicated everything. So one of the aim, well, just, I mean, it's the poetry first and foremost, it is for me, it's a way for me to keep my perspective on the world simple, you know, and if it can help others to do that, then that's, you know, that's great. I mean, I could be wrong. I mean, maybe the world's a lot more complicated than I, you know, take it as, but I don't think so. I think it's pretty straightforward, but we've just moved out of that lane and we moved into a much faster, more complicated, more kind of, you know, irrational way of expressing ourselves, and it's just a mess. So hopefully, the simpler the better.
Well, for safety purposes, it's good to keep it simple. Otherwise, things gonna get
Yeah,
a bit more
we
hectic.
crash. And you,
A question for Brother Jamil. Actually, two questions. I asked you at the same time. What's the main message of the book is trying to give? And secondly, who's your favorite poet and why?
I guess the message, again, it speaks to the overall theme, is that you have to, I guess, contend with some bitter truths in life, and that those bitter truths, be they death, be they grief, be they growing up or seeing the world as it is, are necessary for you to kind of get anywhere. And so that's what I would say is the overall message of the book, if there was one. In terms of my favorite poet and why, that's a difficult one. I read a lot of fairs whilst writing this book. A great book that was translated by someone with the same name as me, but just the other way around. His name is Mehmood Jamal, who I heard recently passed away, unfortunately, I think a couple of years ago. But he wrote a translation of 50 Fairs poems, both in the Urdu script, English, and then a transliteration, which was nice to have. So I would say Fairs is one of my favorite poets, but there's many in the contemporary world. I really admire someone like Mumtaz al-Mehri. I find her one of the most skilled poets in the contemporary kind of world. Boyega Odubanja, who wrote a small endorsement for my book as well. Yeah, there are a few, I guess, of my favorite poets at the moment, but there are many. I always find these questions difficult. My wife often asks me these kind of things all the time, like, you know, what's your favorite this and what's your favorite that, and I always have a terrible answer because I never answer it with one thing. But yeah, I hope that kind of helps a little bit.
Yeah, I got one question for Hisham, and then I will also ask Hisham one from myself. But this is from one of our attendee. Why did you choose to write the poem called "The Chain" as a poet? Could it be said more than appeals to non-Muslims? I think was the person asking, why name the chain, and do you do it to attract different people from different culture, or just
by naming it The
kind of
Chain.
explain the name? I suppose that's the main thing.
Okay, all right. the chain again is very simple. It's we exist kind of in a very interlocked fashion, and what you'll notice about a change is that the chain is that the links are identical. So we are all identical, and we all not only identical in our sort of general makeup and the way we take the world on board and the choices that we have in meeting that confrontation, is it's all the same. It's no, there are no superheroes amongst us. You can't step out of that kind of baseline human existence, and so that's the reason for the title, really. And another thing about change is that it can extend over a kind of a long space, and it's connected to two things, or it can be. So you kind of have a past, and you have a passage, and then you have like an end point. So it's just something about it. I mean, it's not an absolute metaphor because there are no such things, but it just gives some kind of idea of the way that we are, responsible for each other, and we can't get out of that responsibility.
You mentioned, and I think that's my question embedded in that. You mentioned that we are identical. We kind of connected. All culture and all human are connected.
Yes.
Now, reality is that some humans are like disconnection. We have, and I didn't want to bring this up, but I think in relation to connection, that you have a individual who may not like you or your culture, you have races, all this kind of stuff that we experience. So how do you then fit into the chain when he's actively want to break away?
But yeah,
what I'm trying to say is that
I can't hear you very well.
Your understanding that we all are the same at some point fails as a poet, doesn't it?
No, it doesn't, because even somebody who desperately wants to disconnect himself from his someone who's not the same, who doesn't have the same color skin as him, or someone who doesn't speak the same language as him, or someone who has a lot more money than him, it's not in his interest to do any of those things, because he can't break the connection. It's in his interest to actually see what connects him to that person, not what he thinks can separate him from them. So, I mean, it's the point of I think what I'm trying to say is that the strength that humanity has is its connections. All religions are based around connecting. That's the root meaning of the word, the Latin word anyway, religion. It's to connect, to reconnect something, reconnect yourself to God. But the only way you can reconnect yourself to God is to reconnect yourself to people. It isn't done, it's not really done any other way. That's why you have these texts that, try to instill in you this kind of, this human codependence. The only way you're going to get to where you need to go is by connecting with people. It's not, it is, you don't have like, some Christians thought that they could just retreat from the world and go and live in, like in the middle of a desert, and that doesn't do your soul much good,
All right. Yeah, unfortunately we're coming to the end, but there is we got a few more minutes. I mean, you see, the thing is very difficult to identify poetry. I mean, you have a definition, and the problem with definition is that someone defined it, and when someone defined, they have the limitation, they have the object, the understanding of things. It's not something that was kind of divinely given us as to what the definition is. And with that in mind, I think what I'm asking both of you, and this is for both of you to kind of last statement, is that when someone decides to write something, should they take that definition into consideration, which is universally accepted, or should they speak their heart and just let it out, and then define the definition via the poetry rather than the vice versa? And and if they do that and it's acceptable, can then they be considered a poet? A poet? I mean, I'll give you an example, right? Once I know this particular person. I mean, I'm a big fan of Allama Iqbal, and someone wrote something and presented, and the people among them, they said, well, it's not poetry. Then that person went back and wrote something else in a similar, copied something else, and said, this is from Allama Iqbal, and they were amazed. Now, in terms of the content of the poetry, it wasn't much different. So did Allama Iqbal define what poetry is by his virtues, or did the word and the meaning define Allama Iqbal? So that question to both of you, and the last message, and inshallah we'll wrap it up.
Go on,
You want to go first?
Jumo, you can answer that first.
Okay. It's a tough question to finish on.
Yeah.
I think, with this, there's always an endless kind of back and forth. I can't remember the exact quote, but one of my teachers in poetry said something about all poetry was the line break or something along those lines. Just chopping up prose in the with line breaks. And I think what you have to look at is the utility of those kind of arguments. It's very clear that you have a tradition of canonical poetry that has, forms, the sonnet, you have villanelle, all this kind of stuff you can go into, and there's very clearly a tradition and a genealogy of poetry in that sense. And then you have free verse, and I think when it comes to something like the subjectivity of is anything and everything poetry, I think you just have to look at what's the use of that kind of debate. If somebody is writing something with verses and line breaks, it might not be great poetry, but it might be the best poetry. But generally speaking, we know it when we see it. Even now with free verse, it doesn't have to have a form to be seen as poetry. We come from in the modern time, I guess one of the debates that is often had in the UK in the poetry world is this kind of dichotomy between page poetry and spoken word, right? And I always say that that's a really bizarre thing to say to outside of this kind of small English 2022 bubble, because if you go to anywhere else in the world, really, if you go to Pakistan, for example, and say, say that do you do spoken word, it doesn't make any sense to them, because poetry is spoken all the time, and it has a history of being spoken and read aloud, as well as being on the page, and there didn't ever need to be any kind of separation between the two. So I think, to your question, does it become poetry because Allama Iqbal said it? Probably not. I think it was probably poetry before somebody ascribed it to him and changed the name in that story that you said, or whatever. But it does, I guess, speak to people's perceptions of what poetry can be, and that has definitely expanded, I think, over the last 50 years, with new forms, like a particular form of poetry that's performed on stage, hip hop, slam poetry, that kind of thing. It's definitely expanded, but it's still very much, I think, part of that tradition, as much as people might like to, because those other forms that were new once, right? And they may have had people saying, oh, this is not poetry because it doesn't sound like what it's not the qasida that I'm used to, so it's not poetry. And then over time that became less of an issue. So yeah, I think it's more about looking at the utility of those kind of debates, and you probably know it when you see it when it comes to poetry.
Any last word, Hisham?
Yeah, I don't know if this kind of approaches the question head on, but it might do. But I just want to kind of leave the audience and you and with a final thought, maybe the most important thought, one which I sometimes think is, you could talk forever about. The thing about poetry is that it doesn't end here. Its definition doesn't end here. So we can never define what poetry is, in the same way that we can never really define what life is. The only way that you're going to get to understand life in its kind of fulfillment is when you get to the other side. That's that element of eternity that's in every single poem, or it's built into our language. It's built into existence. You can't understand existence without, at least admitting that there's something in it which is, which points to somewhere else. There's a famous poet called French poet called Rimbaud, who said that, real life is elsewhere. So the poem, if it's a good poem, is that it's giving you a very strong feeling of what life is like here, but it doesn't leave out that indicator to somewhere else. That's where poetry is, real poetry. So
okay, well, that's interesting.
That's why it's so important to believe
yeah,
it.
well, Jazakumullah for your time. Unfortunately, we came to an end of the program. It was I hope, inshallah, it was a fruitful discussion, and that we're able to meet the authors. I want to say thank you to Brother Jamil for taking your time, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I certainly have. It's always exciting for me to meet authors. I mean, one of the privilege I have with working with ILS is that I get to talk to amazing people, amazing authors. So that's my reward in this world. As for the rest of it, I'll leave it in the hereafter, inshallah. So Jazakumullah khairan for your time and taking out and sharing your thought and your wonderful book. And I strongly advise everyone to buy the book. It is fascinating. I mean, look, everyone writes the way they want to write, but I really enjoyed Jamil's book because it speaks from that. I mean, there are a number of examples in that book that you can relate directly to, and I found it amazing. So I advise everyone strongly to buy it and kind of share it with your family. And yeah, and also Brother Hisham, thank you for your time. Thank you for donating to the book to ILS.
Yeah,
I advise you guys to buy the book as well, albeit because ILS will make some money out of it to fund this project. But it is a book that you can kind of understand the history of the world in a kind of summary way, and it gives you the skeleton. Then you can go around and do your own research and kind of put the flesh into it. It is an interesting book. It's available in Amazon, albeit a bit on the dear side. But yeah, so inshallah, I advise you all to buy it. And also, please visit the website. We got a few more programs coming. We got live in the works of Allama Iqbal, live in the works of Muhammad Abdul Wahab Al-Masri from Egypt. We got a few lectures coming up, podcasts coming up. So keep in touch with ILS and support the project whatever way. It is a platform to encourage Muslim, particularly, by everyone to read. Unfortunately, we don't read these days. Right? We just became a iPad society, unfortunately. So yeah, please visit the website. It's islamicliteracysociety.com and engage with as much as you can. Any comment, any recommendation, feel free. Inshallah, we will answer you. And once again, Jazakumullah, the two authors and everyone for coming and taking your time. And inshallah, we hope to see you very soon in another event similar to that. Barakallah fi. Inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Thank you, bro. Assalamu alaikum.